So obviously the title of this lecture is The History and the Development of the Art Quilt Movement, Early Exhibits and Studio Art Quilt Associates. One of my first exhibits was any place you could have an exhibit, you exhibited your work. And this was a fabric store in Berkeley called Patience Corners. And I got the window display, and I actually had somebody silkscreen this block, which was called Colored Cloth. And it was really a wearable art show. And I had this figure that I did as a weaver in 1976, 75. And it was one of the props for the show, because the Weavers Conference, because I was going to wear this outfit. And I put the garment on and I went, well, you look like a clown. So I actually made a clown, and he actually traveled with me in the car many times. I had her propped up in the passenger seat, so it looked like I was driving home somebody who had a few to drink. In 1981, I was invited to have an exhibit at Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, at a gallery. And Penny McMorris called me and she said, I'd like to film you for the PBS quilting show I'm doing. Could you just do a little demonstration while I'm there? And I said, you know what, somebody just came and asked me to make a wedding dress, and she gave me this thing, and I think I'll demonstrate that. She said, oh, that was fine. So, 1981, I demonstrated the first time ever the Olfa cutter. I did not have a template. I stacked up newspapers with cardboard on top and used a Draftsman see-through ruler. And after that television show, some woman's husband said, well, I can cut plastic and I'll cut templates. And that's how it all started. We didn't have the mat back then. So this was my wearable art exhibit. I really started as a wearable artist. And if it weren't for my wearable art, I don't think I'd be where I am today. And Holly Brackman invited me to teach at Mendocino Art Center. And that's how I got started. I got tired of photocopying my handouts for my wearable art class. And so I did a little book called 5 Ethnic Patterns. It sold for $3.50. And Fiber Arts called me on the phone and did an interview, and the last thing the woman said was, and what's new in your life? I said, I have this little book. I sold out my inventory within about 3 weeks. So I got into the mail order business. I hired somebody to manage my inventory, and I self-published 5 books. And then I did 4 books with C&T Publishing. So in 1983, I think it was, Barbara Brackman and Chris Wolfe Edmonds curated a show at the Spencer Museum, Barton, Lawrence, Kansas. And the name of the show was Influences, and we used an antique quilt and then made a contemporary one, our version of the antique quilt. And I know somebody just did that recently again. So this was a pineapple quilt, and this is Chris Wolfe Edmonds' hand-dyed fabrics. This is 1983. This is a woman whose name is Pamela Gustafson, and she was using Indiana puzzle or monkey wrench for her contemporary version. So I was invited again to teach wearable art in Calgary, Canada in 1983. And I walked in and saw this quilt show, and I thought, well, this doesn't look like your grandmother's quilt. So this was again, we hung quilts wherever we could. This is the cafeteria at the college in Calgary. And I thought that these things were amazing. The graphics for 1983 were quite stunning. In 1984, Chris Wolfe Edmonds and I had a show at the Gail Wilson Gallery in Southampton, New York. And I had shown with Gail a couple years before. And so this piece is, again, I got the window. You know, things fade in the window. Did you know that? So Chris did quilts and I did wearable. Oh, and by the way, I sold, not that kimono, but I had a kimono in the show, and it went to a Broadway producer. And so that was Chris's quilt, and I have a kimono on the wall there. And another one of Chris's and mine's on the other side. So this is, Michael James curated this exhibit at Cornell University. And as you can see, I'm using the same kimono I used at the show in New York. And it's Linda McDonald, Michael James, and Nancy Crow. And I can't remember at that time who were the other artists. So I think that the 1985 Quilt National was one of the most outstanding because it was the first time we saw quilts that were not rectangles. Again, that same kimono of mine is in the show. By the way, that kimono belongs to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art after I showed it a lot. So this is by Jean Hughes. And as you can see here, there's one by Faye Anderson, and the one that's got the top folded over is by Judy Warren. And she made a quilt and then folded the top down. And on the side, you can just barely see one that has a piece that extends from the surface of the quilt. So this is 1985. The one in the back is by Diana Prentice from Australia. And this is our dear Terry Nangat, who's sitting over there in the red shirt. And this was her, her reverse applique. I'm not going to tell you titles because I can remember names, but I don't remember titles that well. And this is the t-shirt you could buy at the Dairy Barn. At the time, I only had 3 grandchildren. Now I have 11. So I stopped buying t-shirts. This is an exhibit that was also in 1980s at Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. And again, we sing the same quilt from Linda McDonald. And then Sonia Lee Barrington is the one with the geometric. And what's her name? Vicki Johnson is the squares, the checkerboards. And Joan Schultz and Diana Leone. And these are, I apologize, but these are the slides we took back then. And that's mine, which now belongs to the Kojin Textile Museum in Seoul, Korea. And another one there, another white one. So 5 artists in 1985 got together to organize an exhibit at the San Francisco Arts Commission. Leslie Carabas, Joan Schultz, Sonia Lee Barrington, Linda McDonald, and myself. And we called it 5 Artist Quilts, and I got the window again. And that one did fade. So it's, what I was doing at the time is strip piecing. That's called Stella. It's 5 panels. Some of them hang away from the wall. And on the back of the wall is a piece called Pieces and Parts, which was lost for many, many years, 10 years. And when I turned over Sakwa in 2000, I found that piece. It had been made into a garment. If you want to know what happens to quilts, that's a whole nother lecture. And I've been through arbitration and an insurance claim. I've been through it all. I've been standing up for us people who make quilts for a long time. So this is the installation, and my assistant who worked for me for years broke her arm, and I said, well, you're coming to help us hang the show in. So Joan Schultz is on the back wall. And this is some of Leslie's work. And Leslie just recently had a show in New York. So we're still creating artwork. So this is from the opening of the Art Quilt, which was at Barnsdale Park in Los Angeles in 1986. We were invited to create the works in 1984, and they were photographed. And then we had to store them. They had to be larger than 100 inches. Well, that was a suggested size. So they asked me if I would make an 18-foot tall kimono. I said, okay, I'm 5. At the time I was 5 foot 5 inches tall. Now I've shrunk. But I said, you know, I don't think I can deal with that. So how about if I just double my size? And they said, well, okay, but we want to make it the entry piece. Now, what does an entry piece mean? I didn't know what an entry piece meant. It meant it's the first piece you saw when you walked into the gallery. And again, there was a window and a window. And my friend, actually I got a speeding ticket on the way to the opening, but I had a friend with me, and pedal to the metal, you know, cruising down Highway 99. And as we're walking into the opening at Barnsdale Park, my friend grabs me and she gasps. And I said, oh my God, maybe she's having a heart attack or something. This is 1986. And she said, look. And through the door you could see my piece. So here we are, Therese May, and I'm in the middle, and Joan Schultz. The way we were.
That's cute.
And guess who that is? Still wearing black and white, by the way. So that gives you a sense of scale of the size of the piece. If I stood, well, I had to rent a building to actually see it. And I did have a guy who was 6 foot 4 inches tall help me get it through the sewing machine. It took 6 months to make. It's 6 layers. The under kimono is 2 inches thick, and it's patchwork on the inside, a silk on the exterior, and the padded collar and hem and cuffs show through a 22-foot long piece that goes over it and then ties under the sleeve and down the sides. So it was made in 1984 and photographed, and where did I store it? Over my head. Literally, we made a sling and we attached it to the beam of my ceiling. And the sling came down. It was, you know, wooden frame with fabric, like a stretcher bar frame. Put the kimono on it, one of us on each side, drug it up to the top, and then we hoisted it up and hooked it onto the second beam in my studio. It hung over my head for 2 years. And I had visions of the local newspaper saying, artist killed by giant kimono. So I called it Megamono, kimono, his thing to wear. I called it Megamono, but the real title is Snow on Mount Fuji. And that exhibit traveled for almost 3 years. So it was Michael James, Jean Hughes, Therese May, Gail Frost, and Duncan Slade, Pam Studstill, Yvonne Porcella, Ruth McDonald, Joan Schultz, Pauline Burbage, Reese Nagin, Jan Myers, Deborah Felix, Veronica Fitzgerald, Nancy Crow, and Terry. And Terry had 3 pieces in the show. Stand up, Terry. She's sitting over there working on a quilt. So this was in Huntsville, Alabama. And I wanted to show this slide because it shows the 3-dimensional screen that Frost and Slade did. That's a painted textile mounted on a wooden frame. And then Pam Studstill's in the back, and one of Terry's is way in the back. So the catalogs from some of these exhibits are quite spectacular if you can get a hold of them. So one on your left is the new quilt. And that happens to be one of my pieces that I did when I tore the cartilage in my knee. The one in the middle is another quilt national. That's the year I judged the show. Then in the back is the art quilt. The art quilt, if you can get a hold of that, is the absolutely most beautiful book. I pulled it out the other day, and it's many, many pages of dialogue about the history of the quilt by Penny McMorris and Michael Kyle. And then all just gorgeous, gorgeous pictures of the quilts. There were 25 quilts and 16 artists. Now on the bottom is a book that was printed in German, and it's by Whitney Otto. It's called Quilt. And I can't read it because it's in German. But it
I'll
has...
read it for you.
Oh, can you? That's right. It has a detail of my quilt that belongs to the Smithsonian on the cover. And the title of that quilt is Takoage. And I made it in 1980, exhibited it in 1980. It has an extensive history of touring France, South America, Turkey, United States. And I retired it until the Smithsonian called and said we'd like to purchase a quilt that has a long provenance. And so that's the very first quilt I ever made is Takoage, and it belongs to the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian. And then it went on a national tour for 2 years, and they called and said, can we use part of it on the cover of the poster and the catalog? And, oh yeah, the DVD we're gonna do. And I said, will you own it? And they said, yes, but we just want your permission. And so my quilt frames Apollo 13 astronaut and Dorothy's ruby slippers, and there was Rodin's sculpture of Walking Man in that exhibit. And my son said to me, Rodin, my mother. Rodin, my mother. And I said, it's not your mother anymore, it's an object. So the touring venues of Quilt National 87 and 89 and other exhibits and artists having fun on the road. I wouldn't do this if it wasn't fun, and I've had more fun in life you can imagine. This is the window, again, of the Museum of Arts and American Craft Museum, on 53rd Street, across the street from Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And this was 1987. And this is Dries May in the foreground. In the background is Patrick Dorman, and he's somebody that we haven't heard of since. And this is the exhibition where Victoria Jacobs did the sphere. You can almost see it. It was in the middle of the gallery that Rebecca Stevens talked about. And my quilt is in this show, and that's Susan Shy. And I was artist in residence for a week, and I was doing Seminole piecing. Many, many years later, about 3 years ago, my son was artist in residence in that same, now it's called Museum of Art and Design. My son was residence for about 6 months. So we had a lot of fun on the road. This is Judy Warren, Nancy Halpern, and myself. And Judy Warren is just about ready to throw sequins on me. We had this thing about mailing this packet of red stars to each other. And, you know, I still find them. I mean, this is 1989 or something like that. And all these little, so she's, if you see, notice her hand is in the throwing position. But then, Katie Pasquini and I, two tired tourists on tour, went to Niagara Falls together. And we Judy Warren couldn't go with us, so we tape recorded our trip, and I have that tape of two tired tourists on tour, and we would put our little microphone, our little recorder in front of people and say, "Can you talk to Judy?" We got back, we were so excited to let her listen to it, and she kind of went, "So?" It had more impact on us than it did on her. Now I wanted to show you, this is a class at Quilting by the Lake in Cazenovia. This is Barbara Mortensen. And Barbara Mortensen, one of my goals when I started SAQA was to do a bibliography of all the books that were currently being created in the new movement. And Barbara volunteered. She was a librarian. She volunteered to do that. And you know, God love her, she passed away before she could accomplish the task. So my goal was educate, document, and advocate for the art quilt. And document was part of that. So again, where do we show our work? And this quilt shop in Berkeley still has a gallery in the back. It's called New Pieces, and I got the window again. And I think it's very, I'm sure she'd be embarrassed to know that I forgot this, but this is a return postcard at, undeliverable, and that says Yvonne Porcella having a show here. And so this is the piece that SAQA purchased in the year 2000 and gifted to the the museum, Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina, in my honor. And it's called, This is a Long Distance Call. And it's a two-sided quilt about one of my trips to Japan. So in 1993, Holly and I, actually 1992, Holly and I made a lot of trips back and forth to Los Angeles, to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and we organized a quilt symposium at LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, in conjunction with Sandy Fox, who was the curator of quilts at that time. And we had, we filled the auditorium, and we had curators and conservationists and artists there. And it was the worst day in the history of Los Angeles for rain. They said, do not drive in Los Angeles today if you can possibly help it. And everybody who had a ticket came. So we were very excited, but Holly and I are resting on our laurels after doing a very successful conference. So in 1989, I was invited, because of that 5 artist quilt exhibit, which traveled to Georgia. I was called on the phone by Martha Cannell, who owned at the time, with her husband Pat, the Great American Gallery in Atlanta, and she invited me to be one of her artists. So in 1989, she said, you know, we're doing this big thing, Quilt National 87 is going to be at the Hine Museum, and our gallery wants to show quilts, and there's 2 or 3 other galleries that want to show quilts, and the History Museum is going to show paisley shawls and garments. Can you curate an exhibit? So I did. And it was called Americana Enshrined. And there's Holly Junker, Jane Birch Cochran, Therese May, myself, and Terry again. And Terry's the one that's kind of kneeling down. The quilts on the wall are Holly Junker, Jane Birch Cochran, and Therese May.
That's a Nancy Crow purse I was carrying.
And so this is Jane Birch Cochran's. It's called For Our Grandmothers. If you look her up on the internet, her quilts were just amazing. Now this was by Kay Burlingham, and it's one of my all-time favorite quilts. It's called Squeeze Me, Please Me. And it's a documentary on the ivory soap bottle designed by some man, so when you squeeze the bottle, you're squeezing the woman's waist. And it's a beauty contest, and the ivory soap bottle that's all decorated is out on the catwalk, and then hanging from the bottom are the plastic gloves, because your hands will be as soft as ever if you use ivory soap. So this is how Sakwa was born. We were sitting on the floor of the gallery, and Martha insisted that I start a national organization. She said, I can't sell the work of an individual artist, but I can sell the work of artists, plural. And I want you to start this organization. And I said, oh, what the heck? I don't have anything else to do. So, I had been on other things. I ran Convergence 74. I was the publicity chairman of that. And Holly Brackman can attest to the fact that I was on the board of Northern California Hand Weavers, the regional. So I knew how to run a conference for 1,500 people. I mean, it was easy. I mean, even had the police come to one of the conferences, complain about child abuse, and little things like that. I've done it all. So anyway, this is how we started. And Chris Wolf Edmonds says, ask her, she'll do it. So that's what I did. I went home and I started Sakwa. This is Susan Shy's piece from that same exhibit, and Chris Wolf Edmonds' quilt from that exhibit, Nancy Erickson's quilt from that exhibit, and a woman whose name was Sally Broadwell. And Sally, again, has passed on. And this was a small piece, but they were heavily embellished. And Judy Warren, who's now Judy Warren Bladen, did a play on the word triptych. So these 2 panels on the side actually fold and close the antique postcard. So in St. Louis, Missouri, Quilt National traveled, again in a storefront. I didn't get the storefront this time, but this is an empty building. This is Quilt National 89. But I got the monitor, the TV monitor, that says Can you read what it says? I can't read it from here. Well, it was advertising, you know, things that were happening. And so the picture on the TV monitor is a detail of this, which is called Riding an Eight-Legged Camel. And you had to have been there. This was collected by the High Museum in Atlanta. So, make note of this piece, Riding an Eight-Legged Camel, because I'm going to talk about it when we do the interviews with Meg Cox. This is Joyce Marquis Carey, who was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And these are flat pieces. And she hung them as 3 individual pieces. These were on the cover of Quilt National '89. So Bernice Steinbaum, who owned a gallery in Soho, New York, wanted to get in on the quilt scene. One of her stable artists was Miriam Shapiro. And Miriam did a lot. If you're not familiar with her, Google her, because she's one of the women who started the feminist art movement in the 70s, I guess. And Miriam is a decorative painter, and her work is very reminiscent of quilt making. So I didn't get the window here either, but this is the window of the Bernice Steinbaum Gallery in Soho. And this is some of the artwork. There's a wonderful catalog that accompanied this show. And what Bernice did was she invited some of her women artists who were not quilt makers to make quilts. So this is Bernice's gallery. So this show also traveled to New Jersey. The piece on the back wall is Miriam's piece, and it belongs, I believe, to either our National Gallery here or the one in Canberra. I'm not sure, in Australia. And the first one is a woman found in a basement in New York City, bobby pin advertisements, and that American flag is made out of those bobby pins on the little cards. Now here it is in New Jersey. Isn't this a great venue compared to this venue? And then you got this, where everything's sort of jammed in. But you know what? People saw it, and that's all that mattered. And this is one of the origins of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, and I was on that board more times than I can count. And they graciously, I've been around so long, they graciously named one of the galleries Yvonne's Place. And Studio Art Quilt Associates Northern California has an exhibit there right now. And Lynn Coolish is on the board, thanks to me, right? Oh, sorry, you can't see this. Various venues for the art quilt. They were often paired with crafts. And this is the Connell Gallery. It was Great American Gallery, and then they bought a standalone building. And this was Martha and Pat's gallery. And they had the most amazing collection of crafts. Wood turning, and that's what she said. The wood turners are organized. I can sell 20 wood turner artists to a collector. The glass artists were organized, and she said, you quilt artists need to organize. And that's why we have Studio Art Quilt Associates. So there's a Susan Shy on the back wall, and that's Martha in the middle. And she carried the jewelry of Earl Pardon and his son Todd Pardon, and she's putting a piece on this woman. So this is what we did in 1995. My goal, I told you the other night, was to have an executive director and a conference. And this was the one on the left is our flyer. It was a full poster. And the conference was called IDIA, Intensity, Diversity, what's it say?
Inside.
Well, it was at Aeronaut School of Arts and Intensity. So it was an exhibit, a conference, exhibit, and a 5-day workshop. And our catalog was postcards, which was an interesting project because it's wonderful to lay those postcards out on your table and see the work and what was being done in this time, and then to turn them over and read about the artists. And we did a breakaway box so that you could store them in the box. So So the other catalog is the show that Katie helped organize in 2000 in Santa Fe called Exit Entrance, the end of 1999 into 2000. So I just put this in, I know you can't read it, but those are the board members, and these are some of the classes. We had a poet, we had a performance artist teach classes, we had Sass Colby do books. We did different things because we wanted people to stretch. And we were there for 5 days. And I know Wendy Hune has gone on to teach at Aramont quite often. And then now they have a number of the quilt artists teaching classes at Aramont School of Arts and Crafts in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, on the way to Pigeon Forge and Dollywood. So one of the most successful exhibits that I think was playing with a full deck. And this was organized by Sue Pierce. Some of you here know Sue. And as an exhibit, it was the most cohesive exhibit. We all were assigned a card. They were all the same size. They had curved edges like a card. And the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibit Service sites traveled that exhibit. And they had a beautiful way of displaying the pieces. They were small, about 18 by 24, I think. And it was so successful, they extended the tour, and then Nancy and Warren Brigensey bought the whole collection, so it's maintained. So this is Sue's piece, 9 of Diamonds. This is Joyce Barkmas Carey, who had the dimensional pieces I showed you. This is Lennon. It's a black king, something about a black king in a black suit.
Red king in a black suit.
Yes, okay. And that jacket, you can actually unzip. And this is mine. Be kind to your heart. What do you do when you play cards? Is you drink too much beer and you eat too much junk food. So I wanted to show you this. Jenny Beyer and I taught in Tokyo at the very first World Quilt Conference in Tokyo. And this was 250,000 Japanese women on opening day, lined up with their umbrellas, not saying a word, waiting to get into this venue. So we truly have gone global. So I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I want to save some time for questions if you have any. But I was asked by Studio Art Quilt Associates to do an exhibition that was called Creative Force. And so I wanted to show you, again, no titles, but some of the work styles. This is a very early Joan Schultz, and if you don't know about Joan, she was part of that group of artists, one from each state, that was Good Housekeeping, invited an artist to make a quilt that they showed, and there was a lawsuit about it, because a famous needlepoint artist called every artist and complimented them on their wonderful work. And how did you make that? And she did a book. And Jenny Beyer filed a class action suit against her and the magazine. So it was quite an incredible exhibit. I stayed with a woman in Kansas one time, and she actually was the keeper of all the Sunbonnet Sue patterns. And she had file cabinets after 5 big ones of Sunbonnet Sue patterns. But some of those quilts were in storage, and the warehouse caught on fire. And so she got back a box of ashes. She insisted on getting her quilt back, and it was just ashes and a small little fragment of her quilt. So it was a very, very interesting show. But this was Joan, and she represented, Joan Schultz, and she represented California. Now, Catherine Westphal was on faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, and this piece was actually on the cover of Craft Horizons in the 80s, and it's photo transfer, and she sliced it up. So this was an artist who was teaching artists in a university setting, and she continues to be one of the icons in California about the origin of the art quilt. And this is a very famous piece by Therese May. It's one of the earliest pieces she made, and it's herself. portrait of herself. And she just sold that about 3 or 4 years ago. So there she is. Now, Helen Bitar and I were featured in that Fiber Arts magazine, 1977. And Helen Bitar is from Pacific Northwest. In 1977, she had been selling quilts for 10 years.
Wow.
And this is one of her quilts. This is Sonia Lee Barrington, who has made a living selling her artwork for her. Ever since I've known her. She actually made the sandals for Janis Joplin. Nancy Erickson, an early one of hers. Nancy Halpern. Maria McCormick Snyder, who used the log cabin block. Deborah Millard Lund, who hand-dyed her own fabric and had a business for a long time selling hand-dyed fabrics. This is Francoise Barnes. Francoise Barnes and Nancy Crow and Virginia Randalls were the 3 women who started Quilt National in 1979. This is a Nancy Crow. This is Julie Berner. Chris Wolfe Edmonds. When Chris got into hand-dyeing her own fabric. Katie Pasquini. And Jan Myers, who's down Jan Myers, Newberry. Pam Studstill. Pamela Studstill meticulously painted little stripes on fabric and then cut them into little bars, which you can't see in this slide, but it's quite lovely when you see it. And she always did this progression of color. This is Taffy Brown. She did blueprinting. She still does blueprinting. And Holly Yunker. And Holly Yunker's Flower Seed Farm was the first quilt that Hillary Fletcher, Marvin is here. Marvin's on the board, currently on the board of SACWA. He's incoming board member. And this was the very first quilt that Hillary bought for her collection. And it's Flower Seed Farm. And Holly was my right arm for SACWA. She was my vice president. She had started a women's nonprofit gallery in Sacramento, so she knew the steps, and she and I went to the attorney and made our 501(c), and we're still a California corporation, aren't we? Yeah. And because Chris is based in California. And this is by Sarah Long, and it's photo transfer. This is very early piece in the mid-80s. Elizabeth Bush. This was actually hanging in the window in the St. Louis when we had the storefront. And this is by Sally Sellers. What you can't see in this picture is there's words connecting on these lines that travel through, and it's about the conversations that happen in houses that we are unaware of. You know, although now we're all being spied on. So. This is an early Michael James. And another Linda MacDonald. And Natasha Kempers-Cullen, who actually studied with Frost and Slade, and this is all painted. So it was one of the earliest pieces I'd seen outside of Gail Frost and Dunn Slade that was actually all painted, dye painted. And Beth Gutchin. Beth Gutchin wrote The Perfect Patchwork Primer in 1972, which was the renaissance of starting quilting again. And if you ever see a copy of that, it's written with a humorous air, and she went on to write many, many books. The last one is Gossip, which I read the last time I was in the hospital. And I loved reading it. She's written many, many novels. Her big claim to fame was she wrote a novel about the first child that never returned home, a boy in New York City. And his body was recently found. And so her book was called Still Missing, but the movie was called Without a Trace. And this is, the reason I have some of these pictures, like Dee Danley Brown, they really worked hard for someone.
She still does.
They either took on a very time-consuming job, like being a registrar for something, or doing things that, mostly conference-related, This is Sharon Heidingsfelder. And Sharon was, after Kathy, Sharon was our executive director. And some of our sad experiences of SACWA was replacing someone who was lost. And Sharon was lost to us, but she had all of our documents. And so we had to rely on friends to go to her home and pack up all of our documents and get them back to us. And that happened with Kathy and what happened with Sharon. So these were some really sad times for us. And I look at some of these pictures, and when I look at Sharon's quilt, I think, how did she do that? She had this amazing sense of geometry that I've never seen duplicated. And this is Kathleen Sharp. Kathleen Sharp, Holly Younger, and Therese May would each drive 2 hours to get to my house so we could do the newsletters. I had them, they were being, I would write the script and get everybody to get my articles, send them to Texas, where they were typed in. Libby Lehman, my little was young, Libby Lehman was the editor. They sent me a master, I photocopied it, had it stapled, collated, I paid an address label service to make my address labels, and the 4 of us sat around my kitchen table, folded these, sealed them, put the labels on, and then I hauled them to the post office. So that's the way we did it. Kathleen was one of the artists, and then again Therese. And Barbara Oliver Hartman and Sue Benner were the first ones to take on an auction for us. So they gathered the artists together to donate work, and we auctioned it off. And this is a Susan Shy that I borrowed for the creative force. And Jane Birch Cochran, which now belongs to the San Jose. I had 11 of these quilts in my collection, and I donated them to San Jose Quilt Museum. And Ed Larson, God love him, has a gallery on the end of Canyon Road in Santa Fe. And he still does his folk art and other types of artwork. But you would go to Ed and he'd say, bring me your pictures, and he'd draw you a little cartoon, and then you go home and make the quilt. And so I invited him to make something for me, for an exhibit. And he sent me a little drawing about 6 inches. And I sent it back to him and I said, color it in. And he colored it in with crayons and sent it back. And so I called this Made by Porcella Studios, because I invited 2 friends over and we made this quilt, which was really fun. It taught me how to make a shaped quilt. And this is Linda McDonald's newest work. And Judith Larzler was on our first board. And this is one of mine. And Wendy Hune. Wendy Hune has a wonderful show coming up at the Denver Art Museum. And this is Sally Sellers. Now Martha Cannell, unfortunately, Martha's husband called me about a month ago and said, here's a phone number, call Martha, she's in the hospital. And I called her and she said, I don't have a place to stay, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to introduce you at the SACWA conference. And I said, where are you? And she said, I'm in the hospital. I have stage 4 lung cancer. So I waited 2 weeks and I called her and I said, she said, I'm starting chemotherapy. And I said, you are not coming to Washington. You're not coming to the conference. And she said, oh, thank you. So I told her I would tell you about Martha. She was very generous. She did a lot for the art quilt. She continued working at Aramont and cataloging all their slides, so that now when you go to Aramont in their archives, you can see all the quilts that they ever displayed, and all the glass and all the wood. Her heart is in wood turning, but her home is amazing. It's filled with wonderful art. So this is as I see them. They asked me to commission me to make a piece for one of their wedding anniversaries. So Martha always wore her glasses down off the end of her nose, and she had short cropped hair. She has short cropped hair, and she had art on her mind. And Pat, her husband, was a professor emeritus of restoration architecture in Atlanta and was responsible for preserving the Fox Theater in Atlanta. And so he had other things on his mind. And his family name was really O'Connell. And he dropped the O. And so I call this quilt the Invisible O, because when he saw her, steam rose from his head and he said, "Oh." So, and now we celebrate 25. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here. As I told you the other night, I too am going through chemotherapy. And I've done it for now 4.5 years. And so I'm continuing chemotherapy. I get some when I go home. And I appreciate all the love and generosity that's been shown to me by all the quilters. And I'm just touched that so many of you have appreciated my work and appreciated what I did. And I say, on to 25 more.